Ask anyone out there and they'll say the same thing. The PS2 had the greatest anime games of all time. Anime games in the PS2 were wild. Some were amazing, others were straight up terrible. I have played a large number of anime games in my life so far, and to kick off a long series of anime games reviews, I wanted to begin with a fantastic game trilogy that I found quite fun and fascinating. I really wish they made more, but hey, they made 3 games, so that was quite a blast. The games I want to cover are the Fullmetal Alchemist games, from the first one up to the 3rd game. Fullmetal Alchemist and the Broken Angel is the first entry in this trilogy. It was released in 2003 in North America and Japan exclusively for the PS2. The reason this game was never released in Europe is that Square Enix only targeted the North American demographic because it was deemed the most profitable according to them. Back then, a lot of shows like Fullmetal Alchemist, DICE, Inuyasha, and Eureka 7 were vying for attention outside Japan, and the best place was America. I think back when this game was released, Fullmetal Alchemist wasn't as popular as it is today, so it makes sense why America was the main target. This entire trilogy was developed by Racjin, the same guys behind Naruto Uzumaki Chronicles, and looking at their games from Wikipedia, most of them weren't massive hits. They were mostly licensed IPs. I didn't personally like the first Naruto game they made, but the second one was a solid improvement. So when I learned that they made a Fullmetal Alchemist game, I thought, why not give this one a shot? Fullmetal Alchemist and the Broken Angel's story is set between episodes 17 and 18 of the 2003 anime, where Edward and Alphonse travel to the town of New Hazeguard to investigate a conspiracy involving a powerful alchemical artifact called the Philosopher's Catalyst. Hijacked on their way to Central, they encounter a red-haired girl named Harmony and her father, Professor Wilhelm Eselstein, and eventually they discover that a sinister alchemist named Camilla is using weaponized chimeras to pursue the catalyst and establish her own power base. This game is pure action RPG in every sense of the word. You play as Alphonse and Edward as they go through levels, battling foes and upgrading their levels as they go by. Just like your typical RPG, you can equip some materials, upgrade stats, and all that stuff you already know about the genre. But instead of just being a standard RPG, the game obviously borrows elements from the anime. For instance, if you pass by some objects, you can use your alchemy to turn them into weapons. Those can range from anything: spears, swords, knives, throwable items, bombs, and even Gatling guns or firearms, to some strange and cute weapons to use. The entire charm of the game is all about the use of the alchemy mechanic to streamline the combat flow and make full use of the environment around you. Honestly, the combat in this first iteration isn't so bad. Some enemies do get annoying at times, especially when every hit sends you flying, but it's manageable. The game is surprisingly not that difficult. I only died like once or twice throughout my entire playthrough. The only problem is that if you die in this game, you'll restart from your last save. It gets annoying when you're far into a dungeon, end up dying, and you are forced to restart again. While we are in the combat section, I think the combat gets repetitive fast. You only have 2 attacks: regular attacks using the square button, and an alchemy attack that is executed by pressing and holding the circle button. Unfortunately, nothing you can do will make the combat feel varied, as you'll spend your entire playthrough just hammering the same button forever. Sometimes you'll want to be creative and pick a bomb or something else, or maybe perform a devastating finishing move, but at the end of the day, the combat is repetitive and stiff. The level design is quite linear. You go through stages and at the end you have to fight a boss to progress. There aren't any puzzles in the game to wreck your brain. Everything is just straightforward. Go here, fight this, defeat that, and go through this door. so don't go expecting any mind-blowing level design here. The graphics are not bad, they are quite similar to Naruto Uzumaki Chronicles. They're not technically cel-shaded per se, and I don't know what they're exactly called. So I'll just go and say the game uses standard 3D graphics, which are totally fine. The game is quite colorful with lots of visual effects, awesome soundtracks that I find myself returning to. Now to conclude this, there are some things that I didn't like about the game. The first of them is the lack of a lock-on system and guard system. Sometimes the camera gets finicky, it gets stuck in some walls, and it's hard to know where you'll get hit. I think a lock-on system would have fixed that. The lack of a guard system also made things worse because it's hard to avoid hits, and enemies hit hard in this game. The game is quite generous in giving you lots of elixir, but you always have to keep as much as possible in case you confront an annoying boss. The jumping sequences in this game are not good. Since Edward can't handle ledges, you'll fall quite at times. I also didn't like the fact that they didn't include 2 languages. The English voice acting isn't the worst out there, but I personally like to watch or play anime stuff in Japanese dub. The AI of Alphonse in the first game is not the best at times. Sometimes he'll just stand there and do nothing. You can ask Alphonse to grab some weapons and defend your back, but for the most part he's not very helpful. I'm glad they fixed that in later games. The worst thing that can happen to you is a useless AI. Other than that, I thought the game was a fun action RPG with an original story, great atmosphere, and some great ideas. This is the second entry of the Fullmetal Alchemist game trilogy, and unlike some anime games of that era, this entry improves upon many features from its predecessors. Once again, the game was not released in Europe, as the goal remained the same as before, to appease the North American market. Whether it worked out or not, we may not know. The first improvement to notice here is the visuals. Instead of the standard 3D graphics, the developers went for a cel-shaded art style, kinda similar to the Naruto Uzumaki Ultimate Ninja series. I think this was the best decision Racjin made, as the visuals are insanely immersive, and thanks to that, the game holds up very well. On the PSX2 emulator you can crank up the visuals to HD and you have a clean game for your eyes. Loosely inspired by the early episodes of the anime with a few elements drawn from the manga, the story follows Edward and Alphonse Elric as they investigate a mysterious phenomenon sweeping across a mistress. People from various regions are vanishing without a trace, and the culprit appears to be monsters. During a visit to their hometown of Racjin, the brothers encounter an enigmatic alchemist named Jack Crowley and a spectral entity known as the Phantom, both similarly tied to the disappearances and to the eerie creatures called golems. After hearing of the incidents, Colonel Roy Mustang dispatches the brothers to a remote village plagued by these monsters. There they meet Arnar Glostner, an archaeologist researching the lost civilization of Libis. Their investigation soon leads them to the ancient ruins of Siamsed, the former capital of Libis, where they begin to uncover the dark truth behind the golems and the wave of vanishings haunting a mistress. The combat feels less stiff than the first game. There is still a lack of a lock-on system, but you can perform combos now and also dodge attacks swiftly. You also have up to 4 weapons to equip now via transmutation, rather than relying on alchemic weapons all the time. The AI of Alphonse has much improved now. Not only this, but Racjin added way more weapons for you to use in alchemy, one of which is quite creative and fun. I think some of the things I wish they kept from the first game are how you could pair several elements in your weapons, like fire, wind, thunder, and ice. I think that worked better for the first game, as certain enemies and bosses only received huge damage because they were weak to certain elements. Probably not many used that, but I thought it was a fun aesthetic choice. And speaking of aesthetics, I love how the expressions of Edward and Alphonse change depending on their health condition. They made it even better in this sequel by making their eyes blink and a few other expressions. The jumping sequences are still terrible for me, and some of the bosses were quite annoying as well, but the overall structure of the game and the combat made it bearable. So like the first game, you go through various levels and at the end of each level you fight a boss to progress. I think in the first game they've made grinding slightly easier since you can go back to the previous areas and rinse and repeat. It's not ideal, but it's a good choice if you don't want to feel overwhelmed by some of the bosses or enemies in the game. Take for example the giant golems. The giant golems are some of the most annoying enemies in the game. Not only do they send you flying with each hit, but they're just hard to budge. What I do is just pick the longest weapon I can find and keep my distance, or launch bombs at them. Sometimes I'd send Alphonse to deal with them, but the problem is, he always ends up dying on me. So in conclusion, I would say this second entry is a step above its predecessor, but still has some issues. The jumping mechanics are still not great, the enemies and bosses can be annoying, especially with the difficulty spike, and the AI can sometimes be useless. I did like the introduction of a combo system, new alchemy weapons, and the visuals though. Thankfully, none of the games are connected, so you can just start from the second game if you want to get a taste of this franchise. Now this brings us to the last entry in the franchise, Tsugu Shōjo. To be honest, this is the best installment in the trilogy. The series just keeps on improving and improving, and I can confidently say this game still holds up well today. The problem is that this game was released exclusively in Japan, and at the moment, no English patch exists yet. Fullmetal Alchemist 3 Tsugu Shōjo is an original story created by Hiromu Arakawa herself. It sees the Elric brothers Edward and Alphonse travel into the city of Valdora. There they meet a girl named Sophie Bergman, who possesses a mysterious power, and a sinister entity called Verda tries to take control of her. The brothers must defeat Verda, who takes the form of a monstrous entity after being angered by Sophie, and ultimately save her and the city. The combat feels much smoother now. You can switch between Alphonse and Edward instantly. You have a lock-on system, a guard system, a dodge system, and the ability to execute a string of devastating combos. The ability to lock on enemies saves you from taking unnecessary damage, since you can calculate how many enemies are in front of you, and since you can switch between both Alphonse and Edward, you can easily turn the tide of combat to your favor. I also liked the wealth of alchemy weapons included this time, with the ability to even drive some vehicles and run wild. Recharging your Gatling guns and especially your trucks is much easier now. The soundtrack and the visuals are top notch. Once again, I think this game has the best soundtrack selection of the three games. It still reuses some tracks from the first and the second game, but for the most part, many tracks are fully original. The best thing about this third installment is that you can go back to previously explored levels if you want to level up fast or retrieve items you've missed. I have found this to be great since you have the opportunity to always be on guard in case you encounter a difficulty spike, and trust me, there are a few instances where this occurs. Fortunately, since the game isn't translated yet, you don't need any Japanese knowledge to know where to go. Most of the levels are straightforward. There are some basic puzzles in the game to solve, but they are not that hard to figure out. They mostly see you pushing stuff or clicking on buttons. Now about the flaws. The jumping mechanics are still a little bit annoying, and there are some difficulty spikes, especially against the main villains. Unfortunately, you'd have to either grind by going back to certain levels or exploit the boss's weakness, or both. The problem is, Some of the later bosses in the game are so annoying, and just like the previous games, there are no checkpoints, sadly. If you die, you'll restart from your last save. I wish they made it easier to restart boss fights instead of just redoing the same thing over and over again. So with all that being said, what is the verdict? I think the first game is quite flawed, the combat can get repetitive fast, and the visuals are your standard PS2 graphics. But it is still fun if you're heavily into anime games, especially if you don't mind some jankiness. The second game is an improvement and I highly recommend it. It improves upon its predecessor via combat, visuals, sound, and the AI system. Plus, it holds up very well today. The third game is the best in the trilogy with huge improvements for the gameplay, AI system, and alchemy weaponry. The third game still holds up very well today too, and if you haven't played it already, do so. As a conclusion, this entire trilogy is great and I wouldn't mind seeing them ported to new platforms. Or why not a new story? Unfortunately, I think it will never happen. Most anime games we see these days are fighters or visual novels, and since Racjin has been inactive for a few years now, I think the chances are slim.